They hid his name in ledgers that smelled of ink and fey. They burned the rest. And if you're hearing this now, it means the silence failed. Picture a room with no windows, just candlelight trembling against stone walls. A doctor stands over a woman who has not yet screamed. He is smiling, because he believes the soul inside her does not belong there. He believes he can move it. And Weiss, he believes he has permission. This is not a ghost story. It is not a fairy tale. It is a fracture in history that was sealed over, plastered with polite language like progress, science, and necessary sacrifice. But the crack is still there. And once you see it, you will never unsee it. In the late shadows of empire, when church, crown, and academy whispered to one another behind locked doors, there were men who did not see birth as sacred. They saw it as editable. They believed identity could be reassigned before the first breath, loyalty implanted before the first cry. If a man could be shaped young, they reasoned, why not shape him before he even arrived? The doctor at the center of this tale was not a madman in a cellar. He was educated, decorated, trusted. He spoke the language of anatomy and salvation with equal fluency. To the public, he was a healer of women. To his patrons, he was something far more valuable, a technician of destiny. He claimed that unborn souls were not fixed, that at a precise moment, invisible to the untrained eye, a spirit could be redirected. That a child meant for obscurity could be replaced with one meant for obedience, or brilliance, or violence, depending on who was paying. And people paid. Here's the part they never teach you. Power does not fear evil. Power fears unpredictability. The idea that a man might grow beyond his station terrifies systems built on control. So when a method appears, real or rumored, that promises to pre-engineer human outcomes, institutions lean in. Quietly, reverently. Records show unusual patronage. Private funding from religious orders that preach purity. From military councils obsessed with legacy. From families whose bloodlines mattered more than morality. The doctor was given protection, space, and silence. And in return, he offered a promise older than alchemy. Control the soul, and you control the future. Most men go their entire lives believing identity is personal, organic, self-made. That belief is useful. It keeps you calm. It keeps you compliant. But this story is the beginning of a darker question, one you were never meant to ask. What if some of us were interfered with before we ever had a choice? This is where the descent begins. The doctor understood something most men never do. Belief is the true operating table. Before a blade ever touched flesh, he worked on the minds of those around him. Midwives were told they were participating in sacred science. Mothers were told their suffering served a higher order. Patrons were told their bloodlines would be purified, strengthened, corrected. Everyone heard what they needed to hear. That is how real manipulation works, not through force, but through permission. He wrote obsessively about thresholds, moments between moments. He claimed the unborn passed through a liminal state where identity was not yet sealed, where consciousness hovered like mist before choosing a vessel. According to his notes, this was the only window where intervention was possible. Miss it by seconds, and the soul anchored. Hit it precisely, and the outcome could be altered. Not proven. Not repeatable in public, but whispered about just enough to keep funding flowing. What chills the spine is not whether he was right or wrong. It's how many powerful people acted as if he was right. Birth records from the period show anomalies. Children born during identical hours across different regions, later elevated to positions of influence with uncanny frequency. Men who rose too fast, who lacked empathy yet commanded loyalty, who seemed hollow behind the eyes but terrifyingly effective. Correlation is not proof, but patterns are never accidents when systems are involved. The doctor insisted these children were reassigned. Not possessed, not cursed, simply redirected, as if the soul were a letter slipped into the wrong envelope, then corrected before delivery. He rejected morality entirely. To him, ethics were sentimental obstacles invented by men who feared precision. He spoke instead of efficiency, of outcomes, of shaping history at its root rather than pruning it later with war. This is the part most historians avoid, because it implicates more than one mad physician. It suggests cooperation, infrastructure, oversight, someone deciding which souls were desirable and which were expendable, someone authorizing the exchange. Ask yourself this slowly. Who benefits most from the idea that identity can be engineered before birth? Not parents. Not children. Institutions do. Empires do. Any system that wants predictable men instead of dangerous, self-directed ones. The doctor eventually disappeared from official records. No trial. No execution. Just silence. But silence is not innocence. It is containment. Knowledge like this is never destroyed. It is buried, renamed, and reused when conditions are right. And here's the truth that should unsettle you. You are living in a world still obsessed with preemptive control. Genetics. Conditioning. Behavioral forecasting. The tools have changed, but the hunger has not. The desire to decide what kind of man you will become before you ever choose it yourself is alive and well. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the signal that you are approaching something real. What survived was not his body of work, but his methodology. That is how dangerous ideas persist, stripped of names, cleansed of fingerprints, passed forward as advancements. The doctor vanished, yet the language he used began appearing elsewhere, diluted and respectable. Universities spoke of prenatal influence. Clerics reframed it as divine alignment. Military thinkers discussed early temperament correction. Same hunger, different robes. Men like him never act alone. They are symptoms of an ecosystem that rewards results over souls. And when his notes were quietly absorbed into private collections, the experiment did not end. It matured. The crude rituals were replaced with sterile procedures. The mysticism gave way to charts and probabilities. But the intent, to interfere before resistance could form, remained intact. Here's what they don't tell you about control. The earlier it begins, the less it needs to be enforced later. A man shaped before memory will defend his cage as if it were home. He will call obedience character. He will call suppression discipline. He will police other men on behalf of the system that hollowed him out. The doctor believed most humans were raw material. Unfinished. Wastefully unpredictable. He argued that free will was inefficient, that history proved most men could not be trusted with choice. His writings mocked the very idea of sovereignty, calling it a romantic infection. To him, the soul was not sacred. It was a variable. And this is where the story becomes personal, whether you like it or not. Have you ever felt a pressure you couldn't name? A sense that Satan's paths were invisible to you, while others were aggressively encouraged? Have you noticed how rebellion is marketed, packaged, and sold, while true independence is quietly punished? That is not coincidence. That is the downstream effect of generations of behavioral sculpting. The doctor's legacy is not found in haunted hospitals or secret vaults. It lives in systems that profile children before they speak, that label boys before they understand themselves, that reward conformity while pretending to celebrate freedom. It lives in a culture that tells you who you are before you have earned the right to decide. They do not need to swap souls anymore. They only need to limit which ones awaken. This is the revelation most men resist. The world is not chaotic. It is curated, and the curation favors those who never question the hand selecting the pieces. The doctor simply tried to move that hand earlier in the process, before defiance, before doubt, before the dangerous moment when a man realizes he is more than what he was assigned. If you feel anger rising, do not suppress it. Anger is the immune response of awareness. You are beginning to sense the shape of the cage, not just around society, but around identity itself. And once you see that, the descent becomes irreversible. There's a reason the story of this doctor was buried instead of disproven. False ideas are ridiculed and discarded. Dangerous ones are sealed, classified, and inherited. His central claim threatened something fundamental, not religion, not science, but authorship. If a man's inner nature could be altered before birth, then identity itself was no longer sovereign. It became state property, church property, institutional property, and institutions do not surrender property willingly. After his disappearance, the language around birth shifted in subtle ways. Children were no longer spoken of as mysteries, but as outcomes. Potential became something to be optimized. Deviance something to be corrected. Even compassion was reframed as a tool, to soften resistance, to ease compliance. None of this required soul-swapping rituals. All it required was the assumption that men could be shaped without their consent for the greater good. Here's the darker layer most men never reach. When you control identity early enough, You don't need chains later. You don't need secret police or overt tyranny. You need narratives. You need incentives. You need fear disguised as responsibility. The doctor understood this instinctively. He wasn't obsessed with cruelty. He was obsessed with efficiency. In one surviving fragment attributed to him, he writes that the greatest threat to order is the man who discovers himself late, the man who wakes up after decades of conditioning, the man who realizes his instincts were trained out of him, his aggression dulled, his curiosity redirected into safe channels. That man is unpredictable. That man is dangerous. So systems learn. They adapt. They begin the shaping earlier and earlier, until rebellion feels unnatural and obedience feels like virtue. Look around you. Men are taught to distrust their intuition, to outsource judgment to authorities who have never paid the price of being wrong. They are trained to seek permission for instincts that once ensured survival. Strength is labeled toxic. Silence is framed as guilt. Independence is treated as a threat. This did not happen accidentally. The doctor's myth survives because it names an uncomfortable truth. Control is most effective when it feels invisible, when it feels like common sense. When men defend the very forces that hollow them out because they were taught that resistance equals immorality. You were never meant to hear this framed as a lineage, as a deliberate progression. You were meant to believe modern systems are benevolent by default, that corruption is always individual, never structural. But corruption that lasts centuries is never personal. It is architectural. This is not about fear. It is about clarity. Once you understand that identity has always been contested ground, you stop asking why the world feels hostile to self-mastery. You stop blaming yourself for sensing a weight you can't quite name. The doctor's story is not a relic. It is a warning. And the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. The real experiment was never on unborn souls. It was on you. The most unsettling realization comes when you understand this was never about mysticism versus science. That debate is a distraction for lesser minds. The real conflict has always been between men who wish to shape themselves in systems that cannot allow that freedom to spread. The doctor merely articulated, in grotesque clarity, what power had always practiced quietly. Intervene early, intervene invisibly, and the subject will mistake programming for personality. There are letters attributed to his circle, not signed, not dated, describing children as vessels of trajectory. Not lives, not beings, trajectories. Futures that could be bent, redirected, narrowed. These writings speak of lineage anxiety, of elites terrified not of rebellion from below, but of mutation within their own bloodlines. They feared sons who would question, daughters who would refuse, heirs who would dismantle the throne from the inside. To them, the unborn were a final opportunity to correct fate. And here's where myth and reality blur in a way that makes men uncomfortable. Because whether or not souls were truly swapped is almost irrelevant. What matters is that those in power believed enough to act. Belief is the engine of history. Wars are fought over it. Empires collapse because of it. And when belief convinces a ruling class that human nature itself can be edited, restraint disappears. This is how atrocities are normalized, through language that removes humanity. You don't experiment on a child. You optimize a developmental outcome. You don't suppress a man's instincts. You civilize behavior. You don't destroy identity. You integrate individuals into the system. Each phrase is a sedative, numbing conscience while action proceeds. The doctor's legacy taught institutions something vital. You don't need to touch the soul if you can surround it. Flood it with narratives before it can speak. Reward it for silence. Punish it for clarity. By the time the man senses something is wrong, he will blame himself rather than the structure that shaped him. This is why modern men feel an exhaustion that sleep cannot cure, a dull rage without a target, a sense of being misaligned with the world but unable to articulate why. That is not weakness. That is the residue of suppression. The body remembers what the mind was trained to forget. The story you are hearing now was not preserved to enlighten you. It survived by accident, through fragments, rumors, patterns too consistent to erase completely. And accidents like this are dangerous, because they awaken questions that cannot be safely answered within the system. Once a man begins asking who benefits from his confusion, he is already stepping outside the design. There is a moment in every controlled system when the mask slips, not because of rebellion, but because of excess. The doctor's patrons pushed too far. Not in public, But in ambition, they stopped asking whether something should be done and focused only on whether it could be scaled. That is when quiet horrors become structural ones. Fragments from the era describe a shift. Fewer rituals, more procedures, less reverence, more repetition. What was once treated as sacred interference became routine manipulation. And routine is where conscience goes to die. The doctor warned them, according to one surviving account, that repetition without restraint would attract attention. Not from the masses, but from rival powers. Knowledge like this is never monopolized for long. Here is the hidden war most men never learn about. Elites do not fight over land alone. They fight over methods of shaping humans. Whoever controls the process controls the future generations without ever firing a shot. This is why certain truths are buried while others are loudly debated. The real weapons are never placed on display. As whispers spread, factions emerged. Some believed the practice should be reserved only for critical bloodlines. Others argued it should be expanded to stabilize entire populations. The disagreement was not moral. It was logistical. How much interference could be hidden before reality pushed back? And reality always pushes back. Children born under these programs, whether through ritual, conditioning, or early intervention, began to display something unexpected. Not obedience, not loyalty, emptiness, a kind of internal silence that could not be filled with purpose or pleasure. Men raised to function rather than become often grow efficient, but brittle. When stress arrives, they shatter or turn cruel. This created a problem no one had anticipated. A controllable man is useful. A hollow one is dangerous. Without internal grounding, power becomes compensatory. Violence becomes entertainment. Authority becomes addiction. History's most efficient monsters are rarely rebels. They are products. The doctor understood too late that you cannot remove mystery from a human being without consequences. The soul, whatever you believe it is, resists compression. When denied expression, it does not dissipate. It mutates. And mutated men destabilize systems far faster than free ones ever could. This is likely why the project was officially abandoned. Not out of mercy, out of fear. Fear that they had created something they could no longer predict. Fear that in trying to eliminate chaos, they had engineered a deeper one. And so the records were sealed. The language softened. The experiments rebranded. The lesson absorbed quietly. Never erase the soul completely. Just keep it distracted. Keep it tired. Keep it doubting itself. Because a man who doubts himself will never trace the pressure back to its source. And that source has been watching you far longer than you think. By now, you should be feeling the weight of it. The slow, creeping realization that much of what you thought was natural, innate, or personal may have been shaped long before you understood choice. This is the doctor's final lesson, hidden in plain sight. Influence begins before awareness, and the unseen hand is far stronger than the one you can resist. You were born into a theater of control, and most men never notice the strings until they are tangled around their necks. Somewhere in the annals of his surviving notes, there is a line that chills. The unborn are mirrors. Alter them, and the reflection shifts reality. It is not a metaphor. It is a warning. Those who control beginnings can direct outcomes without firing a weapon. They do not need armies. They need patience, precision, and the illusion of free will. And that is why institutions love it when men are taught to obey rather than to understand. Consider the midwives, apprentices, and physicians who followed his methods. Some were believers, others pragmatists. Few asked questions. Those who did often vanished from records. The fear was subtle but absolute. Question too loudly, and your identity is the next variable. This is the pattern repeated across centuries. Silence is rewarded, obedience celebrated, curiosity punished with erasure or discredit. Men call it tradition. Others, discipline. The architect calls it control. It is easy to dismiss this as superstition, or the overactive imagination of a historian obsessed with shadows. But patterns don't lie. Generations of children shaped, trained, encouraged, and corrected before they could speak show up in ways that cannot be ignored. Elites who dominate without empathy. Men who obey without hesitation. Women who fear independence as instinctively as hunger. The doctor was not a single anomaly. He was a symptom of a system perfected over centuries. And yet, you must understand, this is not a story of despair. It is an invitation. To know the rules is to see the architecture. To see the architecture is to find the cracks. And through those cracks, freedom can flow. But the first step is recognition. The second is awareness. The third is refusal. The world around you has been engineered to shape you. Knowing it is the first act of rebellion. If you feel the stirring in your chest, the sense that something has been manipulated before you even knew it, recognize it. Name it. That unease is your conscience awakening. Let it grow. Let it guide. And know this, once you hear these truths, there's no turning back. You have glimpsed the hidden hand. You are awake now. Halfway through this descent, I want you to anchor yourself. Comment below "I own my soul" twice. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for yourself. Let it seal your identity. Let it mark the moment you refuse to be shaped without choice. This is your threshold. Step carefully. The doctor's influence did not vanish with his disappearance. It mutated, embedded itself in systems, and became invisible. Hospitals, schools, even families became laboratories of subtle control. He had discovered that the soul need not be moved physically to be manipulated. It could be redirected through expectation, suggestion, and authority. Children internalized the constraints before they could articulate resistance. By the time a man realized the pressure, it had become second nature, obedience masquerading as choice. History is full of men shaped like this, raised to occupy roles they did not choose. Generations of silent compliance are the real legacy of his work. Look at the rulers who seem predestined for cruelty or genius. Look at bureaucracies that move with chilling efficiency. The patterns are not coincidences. They are the echoes of methods long abandoned in form but preserved in function. Humanity itself becomes a laboratory, and we are the specimens. The doctor believed timing was sacred. The exact moment when identity teeters between instinct and instruction is when influence is most effective. That is why his work was obsessively documented, measured, and whispered about. To him, a soul at birth is not sacred, it is fluid. To him, potential is property. And to men who follow this mindset, morality is a hindrance, not a guide. But the human spirit is resistant in ways even he could not predict. The more you suppress, the more it finds fissures. Hollow men are not invulnerable. Emptiness is never a stable state. And this is where the story of his method meets reality. Systems built to control can be infiltrated by unpredictability. Men awaken. Even hollow men crack. Even the best-laid frameworks fail under concentrated awareness. That is why this knowledge is dangerous. Not because it is mythical, but because it is real, and it forces recognition. Recognition destabilizes the system that bred it. Recognition awakens questions men were trained not to ask. Who am I? Who decided? What was taken from me before I could claim it? These are not idle thoughts. They are revolutions of consciousness. If you are listening, feel the weight. Feel the awareness pressing against the cage of habit and expectation. You are learning to see what most men will never see. And seeing is the first act of sovereignty. The second act is refusal. You must begin to distinguish your instincts from the programming imposed upon you, or else the legacy of men like the doctor will continue to guide your path without your knowledge. Do not mistake this as fearmongering. It is mentorship. It is revelation. It is a warning whispered across centuries. The forces that shape men are older, subtler, and more precise than you have been taught to consider. And now, you are awake to them. Power has always feared the unpredictable man. That is the constant running through the doctor's story. Men who are unshaped, unassigned, untamed. They threaten every structure built on control. And the doctor understood this instinctively. He did not need to teach obedience. He needed to teach intervention before defiance could form. The unborn, the unformed, the invisible, they were the ultimate targets. The perfect canvas. Institutions, once aware of such potential, act with patience measured in generations. They do not seize with force. They infiltrate with subtlety. Language, ritual, praise, reward, and punishment are wielded as surgical tools, bending men toward predictability. Even families, sworn to nurture individuality, are co-opted. Traditions, customs, expectations, all become invisible scaffolding to shape behavior before the first choice is made. The most disturbing aspect of the doctor's method was not its cruelty, but its precision. He did not need overt suffering. He needed alignment. He did not need rebellion suppressed. He needed trajectories corrected. A child redirected. a soul guided, a future mold, all before memory and will could resist. The act itself became invisible to everyone except the architect, yet the consequences ripple outward through every life that followed. Some of his contemporaries recoiled, fearing divine wrath or moral collapse. But the patrons did not care. To them, the promise of predictability outweighed conscience. This pattern repeats across history. A brilliant idea, morally ambiguous or abhorrent, is adopted quietly because it delivers control, efficiency, results. And the public, blind to subtle interference, interprets success as merit, failure as misfortune. The deception is seamless, the manipulation complete. Even today, the echoes of his philosophy resonate. Modern education, selective breeding of elites, psychological profiling, they are the heirlooms of his thinking, sanitized and rationalized. Yet underneath the veneer of progress, the question remains the same. Who decides who you will be before you even know yourself? Who engineers the trajectory of your desires, your fears, your identity, without your consent? This is why the story is dangerous. Not because it is mythical, but because it exposes a truth too few are willing to confront. Freedom is a choice rarely offered, and identity is a battleground fought in silence. Every man who grows, questions, and awakens is already resisting the legacies of those who intervened long before birth. And the weight of that realization is heavy. But it is necessary. Only by understanding the machinery of control can you begin to dismantle it. Only by seeing the patterns can you reclaim your autonomy. Only by facing the invisible architects can you stop being the experiment and start being the master. By the time a man realizes he is being guided, nudged, shaped, he is already deep inside the maze. That is the cruel elegance of the design. The doctor understood that awareness delayed is awareness diluted. If a man wakes up too late, he will negotiate with his chains instead of breaking them. He will seek comfort, not truth. And comfort is the currency of controlled societies. The real inheritance of the doctor's work is not hidden in forbidden archives. It lives in the assumptions men carry without examining. The belief that certain lives are meant for greatness while others are naturally suited for submission. The idea that hierarchy is organic, that obedience is maturity, that questioning is immaturity. These ideas did not emerge naturally. They were cultivated. Look closely at how early boys are categorized, how quickly instincts are corrected, how curiosity is redirected into acceptable channels. Aggression softened, ambition narrowed, individuality sanded down until it fits neatly into pre-existing roles. This is not parenting. It is pre-processing. The doctor would have admired the efficiency. What he failed to account for, and what his successors still fear, is the residue that remains. No matter how early intervention begins, something always survives. Attention, a quiet resistance, a sense of wrongness that surfaces in moments of solitude, rage, or clarity. That residue is the unedited part of the soul, and it does not die easily. Men who feel this tension are often told something is wrong with them, that they are broken, that they need correction, medication, distraction. But the truth is more dangerous. They are sensing the misalignment between who they were shaped to be and who they could have become. That awareness is lethal to systems built on compliance. The doctor once wrote that the greatest failure of any control system is the man who recognizes the pattern. Because recognition spreads. It cannot be unseen. And once men begin comparing notes, comparing pressures, experiences, instincts, the illusion fractures. What was once personal shame becomes shared understanding. And shared understanding becomes threat. This is why knowledge like this is discouraged, mocked, or buried under layers of entertainment. A distracted man does not ask forbidden questions. An exhausted man does not challenge architecture. A divided man never unites with others who sense the same invisible weight. But you are here now, listening, following the thread deeper instead of turning away. That alone places you outside the statistical norm the doctor and his patrons relied upon. You are becoming an anomaly, and anomalies are where systems fail. The descent continues not because it is comfortable, but because comfort was never the goal. Freedom was. Consider for a moment the audacity of the idea that before birth, before memory, before voice, a life could be steered toward obedience or brilliance, brutality or brilliance, compliance or defiance. This is not metaphor. This is the architect's dream. To see life as clay, to mold it with invisible hands, and to call it progress. The doctor did not invent this impulse. He merely gave it theory, language, and a rhythm that history could follow. It is easy to condemn him, to brand him a monster, to whisper madness and move on. But monsters are rarely monstrous by accident. They are mirrors of what already exists in society, magnified by opportunity. The patrons, the financiers, the families, they were not coerced. They were collaborators. They understood the stakes. They wanted the power of preemptive destiny. And like all systems, they rewarded efficiency over morality, results over conscience. Notice how subtle the influence was. Not pain, not terror, not forced allegiance. Just timing, precision, and framing. A child praised for the right curiosity, shamed for the wrong instinct, nudged without resistance until the pattern solidified. By the time free will appeared, it was already scripted. Control does not need a whip. It needs patience, subtlety, and narrative. And this is the terrifying legacy we inherit. Modern society is built on the same principles, sanitized for comfort. Rewards, punishments, social validation, education, expectation, all tools for shaping identity before full awareness emerges. Systems do not need to swap souls anymore. They only need to limit the trajectories men can discover. And those who step outside are labeled dangerous, unfit, deviant, unpredictable. The doctor understood something fundamental. Power fears unpredictability more than cruelty. The men who controlled access to his methods were not cruel. They were pragmatic. A single unpredictable life could unravel generations of planning. And so the methods were passed down quietly, hidden in language, cloaked as science, ethics, or progress. Even today, the subtle nudges continue. Boys and girls are categorized, trained, corrected before choice. Media, education, family, authority, all forms of quiet sculpting. Most men never notice it. Most men comply. But some sense the pressure, the misalignment, the subtle subtraction from selfhood. That tension is your signal. That unease is your compass. Once you recognize the invisible hands, you begin to see the design. And seeing is the first act of rebellion. The second act is conscious refusal. And refusal is dangerous to the system, but liberating to the soul. Men who awaken to these patterns quickly realize that the world has been designed to confuse them. The doctor's experiment, whether literal or conceptual, teaches one central truth: identity is contested ground. From the moment of conception, or the moment you first understood your place, forces have been working to define you, to limit you, to guide you toward outcomes convenient to others. And the more invisible the influence, the deeper the control. The instruments of shaping are never brutal. They are elegant, seductive, invisible. Praise for the right ambition, discomfort for the wrong desire. Social cues, education, language, rituals, reward structures, each calibrated to bend potential into predictability. And predictability is the commodity that institutions value above all else. The doctor understood that the soul cannot be broken. It can only be directed. Consider how easily men accept roles they never auditioned for. Positions, responsibilities, loyalties, all assumed to be natural. But these are scripts written by forces that understand the human mind better than most men understand themselves. Freedom is never given. It is wrested, fought for, earned. And most men never see the chains, because they are draped in velvet, wrapped in praise, hidden behind custom, tradition, and authority. The doctor wrote that control is most effective when it feels like choice. The untrained eye never notices manipulation if it appears voluntary. And the system, whether family, institution, or state, relies on this principle. Men who detect the strings are rare. Even rarer are those who follow the thread far enough to challenge them. That is why your awareness matters. Because the first act of sovereignty is seeing. The second is naming. The third is resisting. Until you recognize the architecture of influence, your instincts, your ambitions, your anger, even your fear, may have already been directed for someone else's purpose. History is filled with those who resisted too late. They learned freedom only through suffering, through fracture, through loss. But understanding the hidden mechanics early provides a rare advantage, the ability to reclaim trajectory before submission is normalized. You may never be free from the architecture entirely, but you can step outside its most immediate design. And that is dangerous knowledge. Dangerous because it destabilizes more than a single man. It destabilizes systems that rely on compliance. Dangerous because once you see the manipulation, you can no longer pretend it does not exist. Dangerous because the very act of recognition begins to break chains without a single strike. You are now seeing what most men are trained not to see. The descent continues. The rabbit hole widens. And the lessons grow darker, more precise, and more essential to the survival of the self. The doctor's work was never about pain. It was about precision. The manipulation of the unborn was not cruel. It was calculated. And that calculation reveals the true philosophy behind his methods. Predictability is power, and uncertainty is the enemy. Men who awaken to this understand that every law, every ritual, every expectation is a lever. Pull the lever, and behavior shifts. Pull it early enough, and destiny itself bends. Look closely at the structures around you. Schools that praise certain curiosities and punish others. Families that reward compliance and subtly shame defiance. Organizations that elevate men who mirror the culture, and quietly push aside those who resist. None of these actions require overt cruelty. Subtlety is more effective than force. Obedience disguised as virtue is more binding than chains. And the doctor knew this instinctively. He also understood the limits of control. A man's soul, even if not swapped, is never completely predictable. Residue remains. Intuition, desire, rebellion. These cannot be fully engineered. What survives the early shaping is dangerous. It is the spark that defies templates, the question that fractures a system, the unrest that cannot be silenced. History punishes these sparks, but it cannot erase them entirely. This is why the doctor disappeared, and why the patrons of his work became cautious. The methods could create brilliance, or voids. Men too hollow to conform, too aware to obey, too intelligent to ignore pattern. The very precision intended to secure control could also unleash chaos. And chaos, once it begins, is unstoppable. The same principle operates today. Systems are designed to preempt unpredictability, to guide outcomes subtly, to reward conformity before consciousness even has a chance to question. Careers, marriages, social hierarchies, political allegiance, they are all channels, invisible yet powerful, that influence choices before the individual understands what is happening. Recognizing this is not despair. It is clarity. Once you see the machinery, you begin to understand where freedom lies, not in opposition to the system as a whole, but in the conscious management of your own trajectory. Awareness becomes a tool, resistance becomes strategy, and the spark the doctor could never fully predict becomes your weapon. And the more you observe, the more patterns emerge. The more patterns emerge, the more you understand your place and your power. This is not a story for comfort. It is a call to awareness, a map for those willing to trace the invisible hands and claim autonomy before it is too late. Consider the consequences of being too late. A man unaware of the shaping around him wakes, eventually, to the realization that his instincts are not entirely his own, that his desires, fears, loyalties, even his ambitions, were carefully curated long before he could recognize them. That is the silent horror the doctor exposed, not through magic, not through ritual, but through understanding human psychology and timing. The subtlety of his work is what makes it so enduring. He did not need to swap souls. He only needed to define the environment, the expectations, the signals, the approvals and disapprovals. These invisible vectors guided the development of identity, bending it toward outcomes deemed useful. And when applied systematically, across generations, the pattern becomes undeniable. Predictable men emerge. Hollow or compliant men, aligned to agendas, unaware that they were always being guided. Some men sense this early. They feel the weight of invisible influence pressing on them, shaping choices, defining paths. These men are rare, and they are dangerous, to the architects of control. They cannot be owned because they recognize the mechanisms before the trap closes. And that recognition spreads, quietly, subtly, like a virus of awareness. The doctor wrote that the greatest risk to any system is not rebellion, but awakening. A single man who traces the architecture of influence, who understands the levers, who names the invisible architects, can begin to undo decades of subtle engineering. And if multiple men awaken simultaneously, the effect is exponential. History has recorded moments of chaos that seem spontaneous, but are often the eruption of recognition. men realizing the invisible weight placed upon them. Systems know this. That is why they cultivate distraction, division, and self-doubt. Men are told to compete with each other rather than investigate the forces that mold them. They are encouraged to seek validation externally, to follow paths laid before them, to accept narratives without question. This is how subtle slavery is maintained, not by chains, but by engineered ignorance. Understanding this is the first step toward reclamation. Awareness alone begins to sever the invisible ties. Once a man names the influence, he begins to resist it, not outwardly, at first, but internally, in thought, in decision, in judgment. And that internal resistance is invisible to the system until it manifests externally. Now, take a moment to feel that pressure in your own life. Recognize it. Acknowledge it. That tension is not weakness. It is the spark of self-possession. The Doctor's legacy is not just a story. It is a challenge. And this is where you begin to decide if you will remain a passive participant or claim your trajectory. The Doctor's writings speak of timing as sacred, of the precise moment when potential teeters between instinct and imposed order. This is where influence is most effective and most dangerous. Control applied too early may leave the subject hollow. Too late, and it becomes ineffectual. The window is narrow, invisible, yet decisive. And those who understand it hold power not over flesh, but over destiny itself. Think about the patterns in your own life. Who praised you at the right moments? Who shamed you at the wrong ones? What expectations were silently imposed, shaping your choices before you could resist? These are the remnants of invisible architects, forces that mold identity with such subtlety that you mistake compliance for self-determination. That is the genius and horror of the Doctor's insight. The most dangerous men are those who recognize this shaping. They do not need chains to be bound. They have refused them entirely. They do not follow scripts. They write their own. And the system, which thrives on predictability, fears them. History's anomalies, the men who disrupt the expected, the ones who awaken, are rare because the system cultivates compliance from conception onward. The Doctor's experiments were a brutal illustration of this principle. Intervene early, and chaos can be prevented. But control is never perfect. Residue remains. The human spirit, even when meticulously guided, rebels in imperceptible ways. A question, a doubt, a curiosity. These small sparks accumulate over time until they can no longer be contained. And when they burst, the illusion of safety collapses. Institutions that believe in total control forget this truth at their peril. Modern society has inherited the same principles, repackaged as education, psychology, and governance. The rituals have changed, the language is softened, but the goal remains the same: predict, shape, and direct behavior without detection. Men who sense this pressure feel a deep unease, as if their instincts are partially someone else's design. That is no accident. That is history whispering to you. Awareness is your weapon. Recognition is your first act of defiance. By understanding how the invisible architecture operates, you begin to reclaim autonomy, one decision at a time, one instinct at a time, one trajectory at a time. You begin to trace the levers that were never meant to be seen. And in tracing them, you reclaim power. The descent is not comfortable. It is not safe. But it is essential. Because knowledge is never neutral. An awakening is always a challenge to the forces that seek to control you. The true horror of the Doctor's work lies not in the method, but in the ideology that fueled it, the belief that human identity is a variable to be engineered, corrected, and assigned. He understood that the soul, or whatever force animates a man, is less relevant than the trajectory it follows. Control is achieved not by annihilation, but by guidance, and guidance is most potent when it masquerades as natural order. History is littered with his invisible fingerprints. Men raised to fulfill roles they never auditioned for. Children rewarded for compliance, punished for curiosity. Institutions designed to produce predictability, efficiency, and loyalty, all while hiding the manipulation behind virtue, tradition, or common sense. The methods are no longer overt rituals, no longer whispered incantations. They have become infrastructure, embedded in culture itself. And yet, resistance persists. Even when identity is molded early, something stubborn remains: intuition, doubt, instinct. This residue, though often faint, can erupt unpredictably. It is the reason that systems which attempt total control ultimately fail. No matter how precisely a trajectory is designed, the soul, human nature, retains fissures. These fissures are the sparks of rebellion, the silent dissent, the unpredictable variables the Doctor could never fully command. Consider the men you admire in history, those who defied expectation, who refused assigned roles, who created paths invisible to their architects. They are anomalies, products of careful shaping gone partially wrong, of resilience surviving subtle coercion. And these anomalies terrify the system more than any overt insurrection, because they cannot be categorized, predicted, or neutralized without risk. This is why the story of the Doctor is dangerous. It forces recognition that much of what is considered natural or innate has been manipulated, curated, and guided long before consciousness could intervene. Awareness of this framework is the first step toward reclaiming sovereignty. Once you see the architecture, you can begin to move within it deliberately, rather than reactively. Your instincts, desires, and decisions are not wholly your own, yet they are reclaimable. Recognition is the first strike against invisible control. Observation is the second. Action is the third. And for the man willing to see, willing to trace the hidden levers, the rewards are freedom, clarity, and power. The knowledge that you can navigate, manipulate, and eventually dominate the very structures that sought to shape you. This is the path. Dangerous, uncomfortable, but necessary. And the deeper you descend, the sharper your vision becomes, until every hidden hand is visible, every pattern identifiable, and every chain negotiable. Every system that wields power depends on obedience. Not blind obedience, subtle, internalized, self-enforcing obedience. The Doctor understood this instinctively. Chains are obvious, control is subtle. A man guided before he is aware will defend his own constraints as virtue, mistake manipulation for guidance, and call compliance character. This is the real architecture of influence, far older and more precise than any visible oppression. The children targeted in the Doctor's methods, whether through ritual, social calibration, or psychological conditioning, were not simply molded. They were calibrated. Every response measured, every instinct noted, every curiosity evaluated. The aim was not to break, but to redirect, not to punish, but to anticipate. And when executed correctly, the system produces men who move precisely as intended, efficient, obedient, unquestioning. But no human system is perfect. Even meticulously directed lives leave traces of resistance. Small sparks of intuition, doubt, and defiance survive, often unnoticed. These sparks are the unpredictable elements, the variables that cannot be wholly contained. They are the reason control cannot be absolute. They are the reason anomalies appear. Men who refuse scripts, who defy expectation, who awaken to the invisible scaffolding of their lives. Modern society, though sanitized, inherits the same principles. Education, social conditioning, media, reward structures, all serve as levers to shape behavior before full awareness emerges. Men who sense the pressure, the subtle sculpting of their instincts, feel a tension they cannot easily name. That tension is awareness knocking at the door, a warning that the invisible hand is present, shaping, directing, and limiting. Once a man recognizes these patterns, he begins the dangerous work of reclaiming trajectory. Awareness alone does not free you, but it gives you the map. Recognition allows you to distinguish instinct from programming, curiosity from expectation, desire from manipulation. And once these distinctions are visible, choice becomes possible. Autonomy is no longer assumed, it is seized. The Doctor's legacy is not horror for its own sake. It is a lesson in vigilance, in the deep understanding that systems of control do not need brutality. They need subtlety, timing, and patience. Knowledge is dangerous because it awakens insight, and insight cannot be contained. Once you see the hidden hands, once you trace the levers, your world changes. You are no longer merely a participant. You become an actor. The descent grows darker, the truth's heavier, but your vision sharpens. The rabbit hole widens, and what you learn here will not be unlearned. Men are not born compliant, they are made so. That is the quiet terror the Doctor revealed. Influence begins before memory, before awareness, before consent. It is embedded in expectation, in subtle praise, in punishment disguised as guidance. Systems have always relied on this principle. shape the raw material before it realizes it is raw. By the time consciousness emerges, patterns are already ingrained, instinctual, unquestioned. The doctor understood timing with surgical precision. The soul, if you will, is most malleable in the earliest moments, before resistance crystallizes, before identity solidifies. Guidance applied too early produces compliance. Applied too late, and it provokes rebellion. And therein lies the genius of his method. He aimed to intervene at the apex of possibility, where intervention yields maximum influence with minimal detection. Modern society has inherited his principles, sanitized and rationalized. Schools, media, families, peer systems, each a subtle lever shaping men before they understand their own instincts. The goal is not cruelty. The goal is predictability. A man who acts according to design, yet believes he is free, is more valuable than any obedient servant coerced openly. This is invisible control at its most effective. Yet resistance persists. A spark survives in men who sense misalignment, who feel that instincts have been redirected, ambitions constrained, curiosity curtailed. This residue cannot be fully erased. It mutates, grows, and sometimes erupts unexpectedly, destabilizing even the most efficient systems. This is why history records anomalies, men who rise, break patterns, and challenge structures that assumed their obedience. Awareness is the first act of reclamation. Observation is the second. Deliberate action is the third. Once a man traces the architecture, names the levers, and distinguishes instinct from manipulation, he begins to reclaim trajectory. The subtle pressure that once dictated choices now becomes visible, defeatable, negotiable. Freedom does not arrive as a gift. It is seized, claimed, and defended. This is why the doctor's work is still relevant, still dangerous. Because recognition of invisible architecture empowers men to act with clarity. Because insight cannot be unlearned. Because the very systems designed to shape life quietly fear those who awaken to the pattern. If you are listening closely, you are already among the awakened. The descent continues, and the truths deepen. Each revelation strips illusion, illuminates control, and sharpens the weapon of your awareness. The doctor's most unsettling insight was simple. You do not need to touch the soul to shape it. Influence flows through environment, expectation, and subtle calibration. Praise at the right moment, shame at the wrong one, guidance whispered in secrecy. These are the levers of destiny. Applied daily, consistently, and invisibly, they produce men who act as if by choice, yet are fully guided by forces they cannot see. History is littered with examples of this subtle engineering. Men raised to occupy roles before they knew they existed. Children rewarded for compliance, shamed for curiosity. Careers, marriages, loyalties, ambitions, all channeled along invisible rails. The illusion of free will masks the careful direction imposed long before consciousness could assert itself. The genius of the doctor's method was not in magic, but in understanding timing, psychology, and obedience. Yet the human spirit is never fully obedient. Even under meticulous guidance, small fissures remain. Intuition, curiosity, dissent. These sparks accumulate over time, and when they erupt, the system is destabilized. History records the anomalies. Men who defied expectation, who refused assigned roles, who awakened to the invisible scaffolding of their lives. They are rare, but they exist, and they are terrifying to those who believe in perfect control. The structures that inherited the doctor's principles, families, schools, institutions, continue to operate on the same logic. Manipulation is sanitized as guidance. Shaping is presented as education. Conditioning is marketed as opportunity. Men who sense the pressure often mistake it for normalcy. That tension you feel is real. It is the subtle inheritance of centuries of unseen control. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. Observation is the second. Action is the third. Once you trace the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and recognize the invisible hand, you begin to reclaim trajectory. Autonomy becomes deliberate, not accidental. You are no longer a passive participant. You are an actor with agency, seeing the architecture of influence and navigating it intentionally. This descent into forbidden knowledge is not for comfort. It is dangerous, unsettling, and irreversible. But it is necessary for mastery, because once you understand the hidden mechanisms that have guided you, you cannot unsee them, and in that clarity lies power. Power thrives on predictability. That is the underlying principle the doctor exposed, more profound than the rituals, charts, or whispered instructions. Men who act according to expectation are easier to govern, easier to mold, easier to sacrifice if necessary. The unseen hand does not need chains. It only needs obedience disguised as choice. And once the pattern is internalized, the individual defends his own cage. The doctor's method was elegant in its simplicity. It targeted moments when identity was fluid, when instinct had not yet hardened into habit, when consciousness could be nudged without resistance. The unborn, the unformed, the impressionable, they were the ultimate canvas. Influence applied at this apex yields compliance without coercion, direction without awareness, and control without force. This principle survives in modern systems, repackaged as education, culture, or social expectation. Children are guided, rewarded, or punished to ensure conformity long before they question it. Careers, social roles, marriages, even political alignment, these are all shaped by invisible levers calibrated over years. Men who sense the shaping feel unease, tension, a subtle misalignment they cannot name. That unease is awareness awakening, the first spark of sovereignty. Resistance, however, cannot be fully eradicated. Even the most meticulously guided man retains fissures, instincts, intuition, doubt. These sparks, small and often unnoticed, can grow into awareness, rebellion, and unpredictability. History records anomalies, men who defy expectation, break scripts, and awaken to the invisible structures shaping their lives. The system fears these anomalies more than open defiance, because they cannot be categorized or predicted. Recognition is your weapon. Observation is your first strike. Conscious action is the second. Once you trace the invisible architecture, name the levers, and distinguish instinct from programming, autonomy becomes possible. You begin to reclaim the trajectory imposed upon you long before you were aware of it. The chains become visible, negotiable, defeatable. The doctor's legacy is not horror for its own sake. It is revelation. It teaches that awareness destabilizes control, that recognition cannot be contained, that the invisible hand is always strongest before consciousness emerges, but weakest against those who awaken. Your descent into these truths is not comfortable, not safe, but necessary. Each revelation sharpens your perception, illuminates hidden levers, and strengthens the power of your awareness. The most dangerous knowledge is invisible knowledge. The doctor understood that overt control is easily resisted. Subtle control, embedded in expectation, praise, and punishment, is nearly impossible to detect. A man shaped before awareness will defend his own manipulation, mistake obedience for virtue, and call conformity wisdom. That is the genius and the terror of his insight. Consider your own life. Who praised you at precise moments? Who withheld approval? Who set invisible standards? These are the levers of guidance. Subtle, pervasive, nearly undetectable. The shaping begins early, before memory forms, before choice crystallizes. By the time consciousness emerges, patterns are internalized, instincts corrected, desires calibrated. The system does not need chains. It has already built them inside you. Even under meticulous shaping, residue persists. Intuition, doubt, curiosity, they cannot be fully erased. These sparks are dangerous to any system. History records the anomalies, men who refuse roles assigned before birth, who reject scripts, who awaken to the architecture of control. The system fears these men because they cannot be categorized, predicted, or neutralized without risk. They are the unaccounted variables that threaten carefully calibrated power. Modern society continues the legacy, sanitized and rationalized. Schools, families, governments, media, all function as invisible levers, subtly directing choices, rewarding conformity, punishing deviation. The more invisible the influence, the more effective the control. Most men never notice. Those who do often misidentify the source of their unease, blaming themselves instead of the architecture that shaped them. Awareness is rebellion. Recognition is the first act of defiance. Observation is the second. Deliberate action is the third. Once you see the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and understand the invisible forces shaping your decisions, autonomy becomes possible. You begin to reclaim your trajectory. The chains are no longer invisible. They are negotiable, defeatable, and ultimately breakable. This is the weight the doctor left behind. Not a method of horror alone, but a map of manipulation. Knowledge of the architecture grants power. Awareness destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. And for those willing to descend into the forbidden truths, freedom is no longer theoretical. It becomes actionable, deliberate, and dangerous to the system that never wanted it revealed. The doctor's work illuminates a frightening principle. Control is most effective when it feels voluntary. Men who believe they are making choices are more pliable than those who obey under duress. Compliance disguised as self-determination is the apex of influence. And the earliest interventions, before instinct and memory solidify, ensure that the pattern is internalized, defended, and perpetuated without awareness. Consider how subtle guidance manifests in your own life. Praise for certain ambitions, shame for curiosity, encouragement toward paths that align with invisible objectives. These are not coincidences. They are calibrated levers, applied patiently over time, to shape behavior before resistance emerges. By the time a man questions authority, the architecture of influence is already woven into his instincts. Yet even the most precise shaping leaves remnants. Faint sparks of intuition, curiosity, defiance, small fissures in an otherwise guided life. These fissures are dangerous to any system. History preserves the anomalies. Men who awaken, refuse the roles assigned to them, and disrupt patterns carefully designed over decades. The system fears these anomalies not for their numbers, but for their unpredictability. Modern institutions perpetuate the same principles, sanitized and rationalized. Education, family, media, and social expectation all act as levers, steering choices, rewarding conformity, punishing deviation. The invisible hand operates quietly, directing trajectories before the individual is conscious of the design. Most men never notice. Those who do often internalize the blame, mistaking unease for weakness, submission for virtue. Recognition is the first weapon of autonomy. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. Observation sharpens clarity. Deliberate action reclaims trajectory. Once you trace the invisible architecture and distinguish instinct from programming, the chains become visible, negotiable, breakable. You are no longer a passive participant in the experiment. You are an actor with agency, aware of the forces shaping every move. The doctor's legacy is dangerous because it forces awareness. Knowledge destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. And for those willing to descend into these forbidden truths, freedom becomes actionable. Once you see the levers, name the manipulations, and recognize the architecture, you are no longer guided unconsciously. You navigate deliberately. The doctor's writings reveal a truth that most men resist. Identity is never fully personal. From the earliest moments, forces beyond awareness begin shaping instincts, ambitions, fears, praise and shame, guidance and correction, opportunity and restriction. All function as invisible levers, calibrating the trajectory of a life before consciousness can intervene. By the time awareness arises, the patterns are entrenched. Compliance feels natural. Obedience feels like virtue. This is why his methods were so terrifying and so effective, not because they inflicted visible suffering, but because they bypassed resistance entirely. Men can be guided without their knowledge, manipulated without protest, and restrained without chains. The early intervention of invisible influence is stronger than punishment because it preempts the possibility of defiance. By the time rebellion could arise, it has already been softened, redirected, or suppressed. Yet even perfect shaping cannot erase sparks of intuition, curiosity, or defiance. These remnants are dangerous to any system of control. History preserves the anomalies. Men who awaken, see the invisible levers, and refuse the trajectories imposed on them. They disrupt predictability, challenge order, and threaten the architects who believed the design was flawless. Unpredictable men, though rare, carry the power to undo generations of careful engineering. Modern society continues this legacy, sanitized as education, culture, social expectation, and familial guidance. The levers are subtle, the interventions invisible, and the rewards for compliance framed as virtue. Most men never notice. Those who do often misattribute the tension, frustration, or unease to personal failings, never tracing it back to invisible architecture designed to shape them. Awareness is the first act of reclamation. Observation is the second. Deliberate action is the third. Once you trace the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and recognize the invisible forces shaping your life, autonomy becomes possible. You begin reclaiming the trajectory imposed upon you before memory and choice could intervene. The chains are no longer invisible. They are negotiable, defeatable, and ultimately breakable. This is why the Doctor's story remains dangerous. Knowledge of the hidden architecture destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. Recognition is liberation. And for those willing to descend further, freedom is no longer theoretical. It becomes actionable, deliberate, and threatening to those who rely on unseen obedience. The most insidious aspect of the Doctor's work is its invisibility. Men shaped before awareness defend their own constraints, believing obedience is wisdom, conformity is virtue, and compliance is freedom. This is the pinnacle of control, influence so subtle, so precise, that it feels like choice, even when every decision has been nudged toward a predetermined outcome. Consider the forces in your own life. Praise for ambition that aligns, discouragement of curiosity that diverges, social rewards for predictability, subtle punishments for deviation. These are invisible levers, calibrated and applied over time. By the moment consciousness arrives, habits, instincts, and desires have already been shaped, internalized, defended. You are guided before you even knew you had a voice. Even under meticulous shaping, residue persists. Sparks of intuition, doubt, and rebellion remain. These small fissures, unnoticed at first, accumulate over time. They are the unpredictable elements, the anomalies that threaten systems built on compliance. History records men who awaken, reject imposed trajectories, and disrupt patterns carefully designed over generations. Their unpredictability terrifies architects of control far more than overt rebellion. Modern society is a continuation of this principle, sanitized and rationalized. Education, media, family, social structures, all act as subtle levers, guiding behavior before consciousness can intervene. Most men never notice. Those who do often misattribute the tension to personal failings, mistaking unease for weakness, internalized guidance for character. Recognition, however, is power. Awareness is the first act of defiance. Once you trace the architecture, distinguish instinct from programming, and recognize invisible influence, autonomy becomes actionable. You begin to reclaim the trajectory imposed upon you before memory and choice existed. Chains that once seemed natural are now negotiable. The levers, once hidden, become visible. And the realization that control has always been exercised upon you becomes liberation. The Doctor's legacy is dangerous because knowledge destabilizes. Recognition awakens. Awareness empowers. And the man who can see the architecture can refuse it, navigate it deliberately, and reclaim power. This is not comfortable. It is not safe. But it is essential. Because mastery of self begins with understanding the unseen forces that have sought to define it. The Doctor understood a terrifying truth. You do not need chains to control a man. Only guidance, expectation, and subtle calibration. Influence applied before awareness is far more powerful than force. Praise at the right moment, shame at the wrong one, opportunity where obedience aligns, restriction where curiosity diverges. These are the invisible levers that define destiny. A man guided this way defends his own compliance, mistaking it for choice. History is full of his unacknowledged influence. Children rewarded for conformity, shamed for deviation, steered subtly toward careers, roles, and behaviors deemed useful to the architects around them. By adulthood, instincts are calibrated, desires filtered, ambitions constrained. Obedience feels natural. Compliance feels virtue. The invisible architecture of control is complete. Yet even in meticulously guided lives, residue remains. Curiosity, intuition, doubt, small sparks that cannot be erased. These remnants are dangerous. They are the anomalies, the men who refuse the trajectories imposed upon them, who awaken to the unseen levers, and disrupt the expectations of generations. The system fears these anomalies, not for their numbers, but for their unpredictability. Modern institutions perpetuate the same methods, sanitized under the guise of education, culture, or guidance. Rewards and punishments, traditions and expectations, shape identity before consciousness emerges. Most men never notice. Those who sense it often misidentify the source of unease, blaming themselves instead of recognizing the invisible architecture that molded them. Recognition is the first act of sovereignty. Awareness is rebellion. Observation sharpens clarity. Deliberate action reclaims trajectory. Once a man sees the levers, distinguishes instinct from programming, and names the invisible influences, autonomy is no longer theoretical, it is achievable. Chains once invisible become negotiable. Paths once determined become navigable. This is the power and danger of knowledge. Once you understand the forces that have guided you, you cannot unsee them. Awareness destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. And those willing to descend into these forbidden truths gain the ability to reclaim freedom, redefine identity, and operate outside the architectures designed to contain them. The darkest revelation of the Doctor's work is that control is most effective when it feels like freedom. Men shaped before awareness defend their own constraints, believing obedience is virtue, compliance is wisdom, and conformity is choice. This is the apex of manipulation, the invisible hand guiding a life so subtly that the guided never realizes they are guided at all. Think of the patterns in your own life. Praise for conformity, discouragement of curiosity, rewards for predictability, social penalties for deviation. Every interaction, every expectation, every habit can be a lever subtly redirecting the trajectory of identity before consciousness has a voice. By the time you question it, the architecture is entrenched. Your instincts, desires, and decisions have already been calibrated. Even perfect shaping cannot erase residual sparks. Intuition, doubt, curiosity. They survive in small fissures, unnoticed at first, but capable of eruption. These fissures are dangerous to any system. History remembers the anomalies, men who awaken, refuse the paths assigned before birth, and disrupt patterns carefully designed over generations. Their unpredictability threatens architects of control more than overt rebellion ever could. Modern society continues these principles under a veil of comfort. Education, culture, media, family, all function as levers guiding behavior subtly, rewarding compliance, punishing deviation. Most men never notice the shaping. Those who do often internalize the unease, mistaking it for personal weakness. Recognition, however, is the first act of liberation. Awareness becomes rebellion. Once you see the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and trace the invisible forces shaping your choices, autonomy becomes actionable. The invisible chains become negotiable. The hidden architecture becomes navigable. Knowledge destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. And the man who can perceive these forces is no longer passive. He is an actor with deliberate agency, capable of reclaiming his trajectory. The descent grows darker, deeper, and more revealing. Each revelation strips illusion, illuminates manipulation, and strengthens your understanding of the forces that have shaped your life. And once you see clearly, you can no longer unsee. Freedom is not granted, it is seized. And those who awaken to this truth never remain the same. The Doctor's philosophy exposes the terrifying fragility of identity. Men are not born fully themselves, they are sculpted, guided, and calibrated long before awareness emerges. Subtle praise, carefully timed shame, reward for compliance, and correction of divergence, all serve as invisible levers shaping behavior. By adulthood, instinct feels natural, choice feels free, and obedience feels virtue. Few ever question it. This is the genius and horror of early influence. The unborn, the unformed, the impressionable, these are the points where intervention is most effective. Control applied here does not provoke rebellion, it preempts it. And the man shaped this way defends his own constraints, believing he chose them, calling his compliance wisdom, his conformity strength. The system's architecture is complete. Yet even in the most carefully calibrated lives, residue remains. Sparks of intuition, curiosity, and dissent survive. These remnants are dangerous. They produce anomalies, men who awaken, refuse the trajectories imposed upon them, and disrupt patterns carefully maintained over generations. The system fears these anomalies more than overt defiance because they are unpredictable, ungovernable, and aware of the invisible levers. Modern systems perpetuate the same principles under the guise of education, tradition, and social expectation. Careers, families, institutions, media, all function as instruments of subtle shaping, ensuring that behavior aligns with prescribed trajectories. Most men never notice. Those who feel tension, unease, or misalignment often blame themselves instead of recognizing the invisible architecture influencing them. Awareness is the first act of defiance. Observation sharpens clarity. Deliberate action reclaims trajectory. Once you trace the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and recognize the invisible hand guiding your choices, autonomy becomes achievable. Chains once invisible become negotiable. Paths once predetermined become navigable. The doctor's work is dangerous knowledge. Once understood, it cannot be ignored. Insight destabilizes control. Recognition awakens resistance. And the man who sees the architecture is no longer passive. He becomes deliberate, strategic, and sovereign, reclaiming a life that was never meant to belong to him. The doctor's insights reveal the terrifying subtlety of control. A man can be guided without his awareness, shaped without his consent, restrained without force. Praise, shame, expectation, and reward become invisible levers directing behavior, sculpting identity, and defining destiny before consciousness can intervene. Obedience feels like virtue. Compliance feels like choice. The architecture is complete, and the guided defends it unknowingly. Consider your own life. Every encouragement, every criticism, every reward or disapproval, these are tools of influence. Subtle calibration, applied over years, shapes instincts, desires, and decisions before self-awareness emerges. By the time a man questions his path, patterns are entrenched, habits internalized, instincts corrected. The system does not need chains. It has already built them inside you. Even under the most meticulous shaping, remnants survive. Sparks of intuition, curiosity, and defiance remain. These small fissures, unnoticed at first, accumulate over time and can erupt, producing anomalies. Men who awaken, reject imposed paths, and disrupt the carefully designed patterns of control. History remembers these anomalies. They terrify those who rely on predictability, because unpredictability is power the system cannot manage. Modern institutions continue these methods under the guise of culture, education, and family. Social expectation, tradition, and reward systems operate as invisible levers shaping behavior. Most men never notice. Those who do often misidentify the source of tension, blaming themselves rather than recognizing the architecture manipulating their instincts. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. Observation is the second. Deliberate action is the third. Once you see the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and recognize the invisible forces guiding your life, autonomy becomes actionable. The chains once invisible are negotiable. The architecture becomes navigable. Knowledge destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. The man who perceives these forces is no longer passive. He can reclaim trajectory, redefine identity, and operate outside the expectations designed to contain him. The descent grows darker, the revelations heavier, but clarity sharpens. Each truth strips illusion, illuminates manipulation, and strengthens understanding. Awareness is not comfortable. It is not safe. But it is essential. For those willing to face these forbidden truths, freedom is seized, power reclaimed, and identity reclaimed from the hands of those who shaped it before birth. The doctor's legacy is a warning etched into history. Control does not require brutality. Subtlety is more effective. Influence applied before awareness, calibrated with precision, produces men who defend their own constraints, believing obedience is wisdom, conformity is virtue, and compliance is choice. The most dangerous manipulation is invisible because it feels voluntary, natural, and right. Examine the patterns in your own existence. Praise for conformity, discouragement for curiosity, reward for predictability, penalties for deviation. Every interaction, every expectation, every habit functions as a lever, redirecting the trajectory of identity before conscious thought arises. By adulthood, instincts are calibrated, ambitions shaped, and desires filtered. You defend your own compliance without realizing the design behind it. Yet no system is perfect. Even under meticulous shaping, residual sparks survive: intuition, curiosity, doubt. These fissures are dangerous. They produce anomalies, men who awaken, reject imposed paths, and disrupt generations of careful calibration. Such unpredictability terrifies architects of control, because the unanticipated cannot be governed, categorized, or contained. Modern society continues the legacy, sanitized under culture, education, and social expectation. families, institutions, media. Each functions as an invisible lever shaping behavior subtly, rewarding compliance, punishing deviation. Most men never notice. Those who do often misattribute tension, anxiety, or misalignment to personal failure, unaware of the architecture guiding them. Recognition, however, is power. Awareness becomes rebellion. Once you trace the levers, distinguish instinct from programming, and recognize invisible influence, autonomy becomes actionable. The chains once invisible become negotiable. The hidden architecture becomes navigable. Knowledge destabilizes control. Insight becomes resistance. And the man who can see these forces is no longer passive. He becomes deliberate, sovereign, capable of reclaiming a trajectory that was never truly his own. The descent into forbidden truth is dangerous, uncomfortable, and irreversible. But each revelation strengthens perception, illuminates hidden levers, and equips the awakened with power. The rabbit hole widens, the weight grows heavier, and yet clarity emerges. Once you see the hidden hands, freedom is no longer theoretical, it becomes inevitable. Now, you stand at the threshold, the edge of forbidden knowledge the doctor uncovered, the place where most men turn away. But you did not. You followed the thread, traced the invisible levers, and saw the architecture guiding lives long before consciousness could intervene. You have glimpsed the patterns that shape instinct, desire, and identity, and you understand something most will never know. Freedom is never given. It is seized, claimed,